Hello and welcome from the Faculty of Education at Monash University in Melbourne. My name is Viv Ellis and I'm the Dean of the Faculty. First, I would like to acknowledge the lands on which I'm speaking to you today and recognise that sovereignty was never ceded. I would like to specifically acknowledge that the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people, communities of the Kulin Nation, are the ongoing custodians of the lands on which Monash University now stands. We pay our respects for our research, teaching and learning to the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung elders and their past, present and future communities. A very warm welcome to everyone who is live streaming this event on YouTube or watching later. You join us for the second series of Global Critical Conversations, events we've planned to take place entirely online and which are timed to maximise participation from viewers and listeners all the way around the world. Drawing on leading international experts as well as our partners here in Victoria and our own Monash education researchers, we want these critical conversations to stimulate a global dialogue about issues of central importance to education professionals and the wider public now and into the future. We had thousands of participants join us for our first series in 2020, and we know that there is a desire for the kind of open, non-technical discussion that this series is designed to foster. Global Critical Conversations focuses on key questions arising from our faculty's research agenda, with its overarching theme of fostering fair and sustainable futures. There are 5 sub-themes that integrate the research strengths across our faculty, bringing together researchers from education, counselling and psychology. These sub-themes are reimagining educational leadership, transforming teaching and learning, shaping digital futures, educating for diversity and inclusion, and enhancing health and well-being. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Virginia Trioli, Australian journalist, author and broadcaster, and our facilitator for this second series of Global Critical Conversations.
We're doing it all again this year in 2021. We kicked this off in 2020 during that year that we'd really rather forget. And here we are again to continue the discussion because there's so much to reflect and look at now. Not that we're entirely post-COVID, but now that we're something like, I guess, on a bridge to what the next place might be, particularly when it comes to education issues. I'm Virginia Trioli from ABC Radio and TV here in Melbourne, Australia. And I'd like to welcome everyone who's streaming us from wherever you might be, many suburbs around Melbourne and Australia. We've got people joining us today from Trinidad and Tobago, Israel, Indonesia, China, the Philippines, Malaysia, India, Thailand, Nepal, the Caribbean, and also the UK. So welcome to all of you, and thanks for joining us, whatever time zone you might be joining us in. We encourage you to join discussions and kick off discussions about this in the YouTube comments and chat section. You'll need to be logged into YouTube in order to do this, and I know that you've got that as part of your registration, so please do that. We'll encourage you also to take part in social media, and you can use the hashtags, hashtag Global Critical Conversations, all 3 words there, hashtag Educational Leadership, hashtag Research in Action, and also do tag in Monash Education, that's at Monash Education, if you're using Twitter. Also, please get involved in our Slido polling, because after we have what I know will be a really terrific and engaged conversation, then we're going to be relying on your questions and your provocations to keep that conversation going about what educational leadership might look like right now, in particular, given everything that we've gone through in the last few years. I'll introduce our panel in just a moment. But this is really, I guess, what we're here to look at with this particularly important group of educational leaders is if education itself has changed so profoundly, and it has in 2020 and continuing into this year, and most definitely in many respects into the future. And in particular, if instability is in the sector now, also if we've now revealed the unfairness inherent in many aspects of the sector, and if that education aspect itself has changed, then leadership logically, the way it's defined, the way it's performed, that has to change too. So as I introduce the panellists to you, they're going to turn on their videos and you'll get to see them. So please meet Professor Pat Thompson from the University of Nottingham in the UK, Professor Iza Oplatka from Tel Aviv University in Israel. And there's Iza there. Hello, welcome aboard. Professor Jane Wilkinson, who's the Professor of Educational Leadership of Monash Education here in Melbourne, Australia. Professor Peter Anderson from Queensland University of Technology here in Australia as well. And also welcome to Dr. Laurette Bristol from the CARICOM Secretariat. Laurette Bristol, welcome to you and thanks for being here. Good evening, everyone. You can unmute yourselves because I think it'd be great to sort of have a free-flowing conversation and for you to jump in as you like. But what I'll do is, in order, let's just get you to perhaps refer to 2 or 3 key touch points for you about your specific context in which you're operating and working, researching and leading right now around education and leadership. And Pat Thompson, I'll start with you.
Hey, I'm a former school principal in Australia, disadvantaged schools in South Australia, but I've been in the UK now for 18 years, so I'm acclimatised, if not enculturated. And I guess the kind of key things about being here is that we've had a very long lockdown. We've got the highest death rate in Europe and sometimes the world. But at the same time as the pandemic's been going on, we've had Brexit, we've had increasing agitation about questions of empire and the kind of consequences for people of different heritages within the UK. And the UK is a very unequal kind of country, and we've seen the existing inequalities that exist around gender, class and race exacerbated during the pandemic. So I think that's the kind of context from which I'm talking.
Thanks so much for that, Pat. Iza Oplatka, can I get you to respond to that?
Okay, good morning / afternoon, everyone. I live in a very small country, 9 million people only, 80% Jews, 20% Muslims, and we have 4 educational systems. And while Israel has faced successfully at the end, and I emphasize at the end of the crisis with the corona, we no longer have new death cases in Israel. 70% of the adult population is already vaccinated. So we have very few new cases of corona. The corona crisis has showed what it means to live in a wealth area, while what it means to live in a poor area. And I will demonstrate during this session what educational leaders could do with this poor infrastructure versus a good infrastructure. We had in Israel 3 lockdowns before what we call desalivation appeared. So we had 3 lockdowns, and one thing that I can say from the beginning, the decisions of our policymakers in education were, to say the least, ineffective during the corona crisis, and not to say more than that, just because I would like to stay polite. So I will elaborate on this context and its implications for education and leadership later on.
If I forget to prompt you later on to be impolite, I'm pretty sure that your fellow panelists will do that for me, because they seem to enjoy that that possibility a great deal. It was remiss of me not to introduce as well to everyone who's streaming today the person who belongs to that hand that you can see there, that right hand. Jenny, say hello. There it is. Jenny Leonard has been illustrating our conversations here as part of Global Critical Conversations for Monash Education right from the beginning. And the way that she picks up what we're speaking about and the places we're going to in graphic form is terrific. So do pay a close attention to her. And Jenny, welcome aboard. Great to have you here as well, as ever. Professor Jane Wilkinson from Monash, can I get you to talk about the context within which and from which you're joining us today?
Sure. Thanks, Virginia, and welcome to everyone. Like Pat, I come from a strong school education background. I was a deputy principal of a large secondary school in rural Victoria, and I've taught in 3 different education systems in Australia. Look, a few points to be aware of for our international guests who might not be familiar with the Australian education systems. I say plural because we have state governments who are responsible for education. And so we have 6 state governments, 2 territories. The systems have a lot of commonalities, but there's lots of differences in histories. So you can't talk about an Australian education system which is why I talk about specific state systems. We had 2 lockdowns in my home state of Victoria, where I'm broadcasting from, in contrast to other states. And so all children in Victoria, except those of essential workers and high needs, were learning from home with school and parental support for the majority of 2020. The Me Too movement has belatedly hit Australian schools. There's been scandals in Parliament, allegations of toxic masculinities, behaviours of sexism and assault, and a recent petition from a young school graduate asking her peers to share stories of sexual harassment in non-government schools has gained more than 5,000 signatures and some really powerful and harrowing stories. And this has forced schools to look more closely at issues of sexism and misogyny, including developing resources that support schools and children to understand important issues such as sexual consent. Now, that's not necessarily as a result of COVID, but it's certainly a critical factor and something to be aware of in that's developing in Australia.
Yeah, I'm very glad you gave that context, and I'm sure it's one that can be shared by almost many, jurisdictions and areas that are tuning into us today and joining the conversation. Thanks, Jane. Professor Peter Anderson, I'll move to you now. Hello.
Hi, everybody. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the lands of all the First Nations peoples that we're on here today, which is customary that I would do as an Aboriginal man. I'm calling in from the land of the Turrbal and Yagara people here in Brisbane. I guess the way, and this is a segue into how I engage into this space, particularly within Australia, is that in the educational leadership space, I'm engaged in what I still call as a colonial administration that is education in Australia, and how these systems actually work towards and against First Nations peoples. And as other panelists have spoken already today, is that COVID has sort of highlighted the many shared inequalities. But I guess for me as a First Nations man, we've had these inequalities ever since colonisation in different ways and shapes. So my work is spanning all jurisdictions, I guess, across the country, plus also the federal sort of spaces and particularly higher education.
Okay, thanks so much. Thanks for that, Peter. And Dr. Laurette Bristol, we'll move to you now.
Hi, good morning, colleagues, and good afternoon. I'm a trained primary school teacher and fell into issues around leadership through my work in academia and then the ways in which I became positioned as my career developed. So currently, I'm actually the program manager for human resource development at the Caribbean Community Secretariat in the Caribbean, and we have 15 member states and 5 associate members. So you can appreciate, if based upon what you know about the Caribbean, I know people refer to us from the point of tourism and cricket. That's how we are best known. But at the same time, recognizing that we too also share quite an interesting colonial history. So for me, when I think about educational leadership from the position that I'm in right now in terms of policy development, I'm quite curious about the interplay between histories and biographies and the ways in which those histories and biographies work to shape our being and becoming as leaders in our practice, and particularly how we deploy that practice to support capacity building and advocacy for social justice, recognizing that within the Caribbean, there are great inequalities. Those inequalities have been deepened by the impact of the pandemic. We can talk more about how those play out, but we are also managing significant concerns right now around vaccine diplomacy and the inequitable distribution of vaccine across the world, and the ways in which that could also mitigate against our ability to recover and restart our education systems in time. So it's quite a curious field that we're operating from right now.
Yeah, I'm very glad you mentioned the unfairness and the inequity in the vaccine rollout. That's clearly going to play a massive part in what happens next. We've got a few questions that we want to consider here as a group, as a panel, and hopefully that can prompt some interesting questions and reflections from everyone listening and participating today. First question we're going to talk about is, how have our understandings of educational leadership and what it means to lead been disrupted and changed as a result of the changes brought about by the pandemic? Laurette, can I get you to lead off a response to that?
Sure. It's important to recognize, and I think Peter spoke to that some of the challenges that we're encountering right now within the education system have always been there. They've been in existence for hundreds of years, from the time we conceived of the notion of public education. And of course, we're now being disrupted by a public health pandemic, but we have also been navigating an significant economic crisis. We have been navigating issues around incredible violence within schools. We've seen it's walked into our classrooms. So our security issues and concerns have been affecting the way in which we do education or experience education. And of course, for us, particularly within the Caribbean and our small island developing nations, we are always particularly challenged by environmental impacts. And some of you may know that right now, one of the current realities we're dealing with on top of the COVID pandemic is the eruption of the La Soufrière volcanoes in St. Lucia that has been impacting not St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, but also impacting other islands close nearby like Barbados. So when we think about educational leadership for the past few years, we must recognize that it has been framed by significant unpredictability, and that unpredictability must become part of the norm in terms of how we engage, where we are living in a world now where everything now is a meme, and where we now have multiple points of entry for interrogation. As a result of that, I think we need to think about leadership for interoperability. When we think about a fast exchange between knowledge, information, and communicating that knowledge and information to serve and to guide the kinds of actions that we're going to be engaged in. And therefore, in the context of our disruptions that now has become a significant part of who we are and how we live, there needs to be a new focus, I think, where we now have more tactical leaders who are able to adapt faster, they're able to communicate for advocacy, deploy resources for collaboration to respond to some of the challenges that they're confronting within their spaces, create deepened and wider spaces of inclusivity, given that now as we navigate inequitable distribution and equitable access, now we understand the nature of the equity issues in a different way. And it therefore requires us to have a particular kind of contextual acuteness. So I think now when we are required to lead in education, these are the issues that we are confronted with. And of course, this now has to change the ways in which we conceive of leading as a practice for the enhancement of the people we work with.
Anything you want to respond to there, Isar?
Yes, I would like to answer these questions by using three concepts, actually, using them from a different point of view. First is flexibility, the other is improvisation, and the third one is creativity. I think that the pandemic has forced many, let's call them moderate principles or moderate education leaders to be more creative if they wanted to face the impending catastrophic in the community, in the school. For example, I'll give a real life example. The government, one of its decisions was to allow at-risk students to attend schools, even in times of lockdowns, okay? Because they believe that this was a very good decision, actually, because they believe that at-risk students will be harmed more from their environment rather than from the pandemic. So I asked school principal what they did with it. So they said, we extended the definition of at-risk students to include unprivileged students, to include those that we believed must attend school regularly if we don't want to lose them. So this is something that made our education leader more creative. And I have many other examples, of course. They created, for example, the whole lessons, digital lessons for the whole city, okay? So they collaborated between them, the school principals, to create something that is beyond the school limit, the one school limit.
That's really interesting. I was wondering, Pat, whether in this considering this concept of, what's changed or what it means to lead in the changes that we've all gone through, whether leadership has sort of been thrust upon some people who maybe haven't had to exhibit it before, or at least under such duress before. And I wonder what's been exposed by that.
I think it's certainly true that almost no principal or school leader in a lot of countries, and the UK being one of them, has been trained and prepared for what's actually happened in the last, year or so. People are not used to making life and death decisions, and it has literally been a case, I think, of life and death decisions for many principals, particularly in areas where things are pretty tough. Kids have got to come to school, but if they come to school, it's risky. But if they stay home, it's risky as well. People are, working with staff members who are ill, with staff members who die, with inadequate ventilation, with old buildings that aren't set up to cope for a virus which is distributed by aerosol. They don't have budget to pay for the kind of PPE equipment that teachers need. I think that's if I can just give you a kind of picture, there was a recent last week a column by Melissa Ben in The Guardian, which was a report of a head teacher stress line where people can ring in. And, the person running the helpline is talking about head teachers sobbing on the line, and this being common. I think people have been working so hard since February, March last year with no break. There were legal threats towards head teachers here in the UK in England, I should say it's in England, where head teachers wanted to make a decision to close schools, but the government decided that they had to be open. So there's been a kind of hardening of the central versus local decision making. A lot of decisions have been made centrally that previously might have been made locally or through local authorities. I think head teachers have experienced a sort of decrease in particular kinds of autonomy, but an increase in responsibility. And we now have situations where, schools majorly mop up the kind of social problems that there are. So a recent report was talking about 1 in 5 schools in England and Wales and in Scotland now operate a food bank. And I mean, that's just appalling. The way in which many kind of communities have fallen back on their schools in ways that always were happening, but it's just increased exponentially. So, I think what we can expect to see is increased numbers of people deciding to leave. They're going to hang on, they're not going to leave their schools in the lurch, but as soon as they can, I think the fear is that many of the more experienced people are actually going to decide it's time to leave because they just can't work at this pace and with this level of risk, for the rest of a career. Sorry to be gloomy, but I think that's the truth.
Yeah, absolutely. And Pat, I'm glad you said that, because given how you started our conversation this evening, I wanted to take you back to just who or what you thought had been lost from the system as a result of last year. And I think you've started down the path there. Peter,
Virginia, I think I agree with Isa as well that in this kind of circumstances, people have been improvising, creative, working really hard, doing what they can. But I think those two things operate together.
Yeah. Can I get you to respond to this first question, Peter Anderson, about what's changed and what it means to lead now?
Yeah, I think actually, it's sort of moving more into almost a humanistic sort of phase where we're thinking about the school or educational areas, as Pat was saying, as well as that they become sites of, wider society. And they've been, for particularly young learners as well, they've been sites of actual stability. When things are going completely crazy outside, you can come to school and there's sort of a sense of calm through developing curriculum and a bit of continuity. And I also see, from my own work, is how we're engaging, particularly Indigenous families in schools And I've seen some of that as well with this sort of COVID phenomenon. How are we actually bringing, this side of education back to the centre of community and as a site of, almost civic responsibility, also around digital pedagogies? How are students actually engaging in our content now? And we've had to be really agile in terms of picking this up really quickly and keeping that learning journey going for students, particularly, primary school into those transitions as well, into secondary, but also I know certainly at the higher ed space for those international students who were stuck here in Australia, who couldn't leave. They only had us, like how did we rally behind these students, with food drives, with emergency bursaries, with, like things like paying electricity, for example, because they couldn't work. So I think the scope of how we do our business is actually becoming much more holistic as such, whereas before you could actually carve it off, this is my administration, this is students, this is some sort of well-being, but now it's sort of all interplayed and intertwined more. And I think for myself anyway, and this is just my opinion, I think that's a really good way to actually think about learning and to think about the journey that we could go forward in.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting note to finish that segment on, because I wanted to take us all to considering the inequalities that almost all of you have referred to right at the beginning of our conversation. It's been the great revelation of the pandemic, although, not much of a revelation to those who have known, and you referenced this yourself, Laurette, known about it from the very beginning, that it's been a house of cards, really. The wealth and the success of our society has been built on a mirage that perhaps there is a degree of equity that simply doesn't exist, and the pandemic surely ripped away the curtain that covered that. So given education inequalities have been exacerbated by COVID-19, what are the new, more socially appropriate ways of leading that can be imagined now? And let's talk about the conditions, the resources and the arrangements that can sustain these. I'm happy for us to get as detailed as possible about this. And Jane, I'll get you to lead off.
Oh, thanks, Virginia. So I think what we've been talking about, and one of the critical things I'm seeing emerge, and I think we've all talked about, is the kind of important role that schools play, but also, and education institutions more broadly. But what it's revealed specifically, I think, for leadership and leaders is the kind of invisible labour, the emotional labour of leadership and leading. And school leaders and educators more broadly have known this always anyway. There's a really critical part around the work that educators do in terms of the social glue that holds communities together. And I think COVID's really made that really clear. It's not just about the bricks and mortar of schools or of universities or early childhood institutions. It's actually about that kind of invisible labour. And I did a session with secondary principals in July, which was right at the beginning of our sort of second major lockdown and after the first lockdown. And one of the things that came through really clearly was that I had secondary principals say to me afterwards, it was like a kind of therapy session for them, because I talked about this invisible labour, because it was coming through so very clearly in the survey and research that we were doing in the first half of the year. So to go to that question, Virginia, I'd say that one of the things that's really clear in terms of thinking and reimagining leadership is that educational leadership, and this seems so damned obvious, but it's not about one hero individual leader who occupies a top job, if you like, as a principal or a system leader or a director of an early childhood centre. And I think we've seen an absolute glorification of leadership in the past few decades that's not necessarily been helpful for schools or for kids or for teaching. And I think we need to rethink, and we've seen this so much more, I think, in under COVID, to reimagine leading as a kind of a shared and collective responsibility. So it's about relationships and it's a relational practice. So how can we build and foster relations of community in more socially just and equitable ways? And that, I think, also includes rethinking the kinds of onerous demands and requirements that we're putting on our leaders and on our educators, because it's driving them into the ground, quite frankly. And anecdotally, I pick up on Pat's point. I know in Australia, with my ear to the ground, that we're hearing a lot of reports coming back from educational leaders talking about how they're seriously considering about whether they want to stay in the profession because the emotional and accountability demands are so great. So I'd say, first of all, part of the reimagining is rethinking the kinds of accountability and demands that are put on educational leaders. I'd make a similar comment for teachers. And I want to give an example. I do a lot of work across Finland as well as Australia in the education system. The difference between accountability requirements is just huge. I'm close friends with a Finnish teacher who's just gone back into the Finnish system after teaching in Australia for many years. And he said that he thinks it's about 8 times more workload associated with filling out forms in Australia compared to Finland. Now, Finland is, I mean, we can look at PISA results and say, they're good, they're bad, whatever, but we know that Finland ranks very highly, whether you want to kind of, take that as a measure or not. So something's different going on. So first of all, I'd say we need to rethink the role of the principal, not as a saviour and not as a naughty boy, to rephrase, the life of Brian, but think about it as collective responsibility for community building. And if we take that more humanistic notion, which we don't actually see reflected in our educational leadership standards like AITSL, but it's absolutely critical, then what does that mean in terms of what we see around the roles of leaders? First of all, it's about a strong sense of community building needs to be there, and it needs to come from the top and from the grassroots of the community. I would say that it's around a collective approach to leading schools. So it's about not just the one person. We have to rethink the role. It's got to be stopped. We have to stop putting more and more onto school leaders. So we have to think about how do we have shared leadership models and structures that will support the really important work that schools need to do. We've got Steiner schools that already have shared leadership models. I'm not saying it's perfect, but the point is there are other examples. We've got Peter here. There are really important ways in which Indigenous communities, I don't want to stereotype Peter, but the way in which Indigenous communities think about leadership as a collective and shared communal practice. I mean, there are other ways of thinking about this. And I just want to finish by talking about arrangements and resources to sustain this. A couple of things. One of the dirty secrets of the Australian education systems is that we have one of the most inequitable funding systems in the world, and none of our politicians or political parties want to tackle it. And while education ministers attack teachers and teacher educators and impose ever more accountability demands on our schools, but they refuse to do the one thing that will improve and increase our equity, then we're going to continue to have problems in our schools and problems in terms of possibly, disadvantaged kids being even more disadvantaged. I'd like to point out that one of the reasons for Finland's earlier PISA success was not their teaching quality, although that's also important. It was that they concentrated funds and resources onto groups of disadvantaged kids that most needed it. We don't do that here. We know that the most disadvantaged kids are overwhelmingly located in the public system, that they have fallen behind even more in terms of COVID and lockdown. And that's why the Victorian government is investing huge amounts of money in extra teaching and tutoring to support them. Why make that a one-off? Why not make that an ongoing commitment?
Jan, I might just jump in there because you've given us a bucket load of things to go on with, and I'm dying to hear from other panellists as well. We've got so many questions to get to. Who wants to really jump in there first of all? I'd like to hear from all of you, but go Lorette. Then I'd like to hear from Peter in particular as well, and well, everyone, Izar as well. Go on, Lorette.
Thanks, Victoria. Just jumping off from where Jane ended, it's so important. And Jane spoke about the invisible emotional labor that is taking place and the increase in that kind of labor. And I think one of the things that we have to understand in this new reality is the importance of self-care in leadership. It's something that we don't talk about a lot. It's something that we take for granted, but we have to understand the importance of self-care. And a very practical example, a very practical way of understanding that self-care leadership is that when you think about, for example, what we are dealing with right now in the Caribbean in St. Vincent, where schools are now shelters as communities are evacuated. What's now the new kinds of responsibilities for our educational leaders and how they continue to support however possible, educational continuity for their learners, and continue to provide support to their teachers who themselves have been evacuated and are now inhabiting some of those shelters. So there's a new configuration of how we conceive of the school and this brick and mortar notion of our management as being confined by red bricks, and in situations of crisis that significantly challenges our notion of how schools are conceived and constructed. So Jane spoke to the whole notion of shared leadership, shared responsibility, a more community-oriented way of engaging, and the importance of building relationships. But to the question of what are the sets of conditions and resources that are needed, I think it's absolutely critical now that our leaders begin, as part of that self-care agenda, that our leaders actively begin to create the conditions that they need for themselves to be effective leaders. So it's important that our leaders push back, and across our different systems, that pushback would look different because those systems are governed by particular kinds of histories and particular kinds of resourcing. So I really don't know if a system will ever be able to create the optimum sets of conditions that leaders need. So it's important that leaders begin to take on a more subversive notion, putting community, putting self importantly first. It might appear to be selfish, but if I don't attend to myself as a leader, I can't help anybody. So it's important for us to put self-care first and think about the ways in which we deploy new kinds of networks across those communities that we work with to create the kinds of conditions that we need for successful educational outcomes.
Isar?
Yes, I would like to follow Jane and say leading from the soul. This is the solution now. I mean, more attentiveness to the needs of the individual student. I think the corona made all of us realize the importance of emotions, of letting the individual student feel attached to the classroom, because he or she couldn't be attached to the classroom during the corona crisis because there was no real classroom. So I would say emotional sensitiveness, emotional attentiveness. I have been interviewed by some of our journalists during the corona crisis, and I told them this sentence. I translated it to English. I said the trauma is huge and can be treated not by the cult of achievement and effectiveness. The educationalists here understand exactly what I mean, the cult of achievement, but by caring, empathy, and compassion. These are the emotions that our students need more than ever before. Ofsted, this is the Ofsted and its parallel, I would call it bad agencies in other places. The agencies of teacher evaluation and measurement should take a vacation for a year, at least for a year. Leave us alone. Virginia, I'm trying to be polite, but I would say, leave us alone with all your foolish and bullshit things that you believed in them. We don't need them now. Our students need our attachments. They need the teachers back in their soul, in their hearts.
Peter?
Look, I agree with everyone. And I think also going back to this invisible labor, and a lot of it is, and this is what we come into the profession, we have this type of, we are emotional practitioners. When you come into teacher education, you're learning to teach, it's that love of learning, and it's like creating safe learning environments. I mean, we say this a lot, but what does it actually mean? What does it look like in practice when you're moving away from assessments, et cetera, and, all of these reporting things? And it's actually, that emotional sort of work that happens pedagogically, creating safe learning environments. How do you actually do that? And that is a big part of that work, is the emotional labor, particularly, with engagement with families and communities. It's saying this is a safe space for your school to come into. They don't actually teach you that. It's something that you learn intuitively. And, it's sort of, it's really hard. Sometimes I think, people say, how do you do this sort of work? And I say, kind of be normal. But it's like, okay, now how do you unpack that? It's sort of like emotional, it's creating safe learning environments. It's also, what is the civic responsibility of education? Outside of all of these different things, it's creating a well-rounded, human being, and I speak at the, you know, the sort of primary level, which used to be one of my favorite areas, grade 1s and 2s to teach. So, you know, it's sort of like creating this sort of love of learning that is not something that's done to you. So I really come back to a lot of the work is holistic and emotional labor that's involved in the profession. And I think the leadership aspects just happen. You know, if you bring people along and they see what you're doing, you know, people will move with you.
Let's move on to our next question, which is, and it follows on nicely from, you know, where we are in outlying, you know, what's clearly shifting and changing. So how will these understandings and ways of leading bring about change for the better or indeed for the worse? And I feel that some of you have started to go down that path already, for the learners that are in our care. Pat, do you want to lead us off there?
Yeah, I guess I'm not sure I'm in exactly the same spot as everybody else in relation to what's most important now. It does seem to me that educational leaders have got, and I will get round to learners, but I want to start by saying I think there's a very considerable intellectual task that needs to be done right at the minute. And I think it takes, there's a number of dimensions, and I'm just going to mention 3 of them. I think one is we need to lift the cone of silence around inequalities, around how much it is schools can actually do. What schools can do is limited. You know, there are a lot of things would change in schools if other areas of public policy improved. So if there was, you know, real attention to taxation, living wages, housing policy, for example, these things would make very significant differences to a lot of the young people in our care. And I think we have to, in schools, stop pretending that we can do everything, and we have to recognise, I think, that we're part of a bigger public policy kind of agenda and actually work with other people in a kind of united way to actually think about what would make a difference to the communities that we work with. So I'm talking about what here in the UK would be called system leadership. I'm talking about getting a perspective across the lives of children, not simply when they come in and out of the school gates. I'm not negating what it is that people have said, but I want to say that I think these things are important. And I think there are 2 particular things that the pandemic has kind of exposed that we need to really seriously think about. One is the way in which the institutions of the home, the school, and work have actually evolved together. They're kind of symbiotic, they're interlocked. And I think we can see in the way that, you know, you can't close schools. You have to keep schools open in order that people who are essential for the economy can actually keep working. You know, it makes a lot of those conversations about deschooling and children running free around the community without teachers. It shows that those things are probably unrealistic. And if we're talking about, you know, really big conversations about what does the future school look like, we can't do that in isolation. We have to think about what other things are involved as well. So how does this connect with families and homes and what it is that parents and carers actually do? And I think that's a kind of exciting thing to think about. I think we ought to actually see this as a real opportunity. We've got a kind of once in a, you know, few decades opportunity to actually think about the way in which these institutions are tangled together. And the other thing I think we've got an opportunity to think about is not learning loss and not tutors, but actually what kind of world are we going into? What kind of curriculum do we actually think children need in order to cope with the world that we've got in front of us? If you look at most of our national curricula, they're hopeless. You know, they don't actually kind of deal with the big sort of questions. They don't look at ways in which children can develop foundational disciplines and interdisciplinary thinking and the kinds of, I guess, ways of working together that are important. So I suppose I'm thinking about system leadership and educational, like really educational, focusing on not simply relations, but actually what it is that the stuff is that kids are learning in the classroom. And I think really that's what we need to be kind of focused on at the moment. I think it's too easy to get caught up in the kind of short term. We have to do short and longer term at the same time. I don't think I asked you a question, but that's where I am.
No, No, I think you did in parts, but I'm going to take you back to, because I would like your reflections on, I guess, the more sobering part of that question, which is the potential negative about what changes for the worse. And there's a live threat here, isn't there? And I think, Jane's alluded to it in particular, and others as well, in terms of who has been lost out of the system or discouraged out of the system in terms of leadership, simply because of the year that we've had, the pressures that have been building up for years, really, that layer of, invisible labour that you spoke about, and what's lost as a result of that. Do you have any reflections on that, Pat?
Well, I want to say that I think the group of people that are educational leaders are still, by and large, white, Anglo males, certainly in the UK. I think there are increasing numbers of women, but, the number of Black and Asian school leaders, for instance, in the UK is minuscule. So, in no way representative of the kind of population. So I think we need to avoid thinking that it was good and now it's suddenly going to be bad. Actually, some of the things that needed sorting out are still there, and we need to actually kind of deal with those. And we did know that before the pandemic, there were a number of people who were sitting in assistant and deputy principal positions who actually didn't want to do the job either, because they looked at what the boss was doing and thought, there's no way I'm going to do that level of work.
Yeah.
So I think, there is a kind of a need to actually not only look at and understand, I think, who's making a decision to go now and what's being lost in terms of expertise and kind of funds of knowledge that are going out of the system, but also how it is that the system might have an opportunity to actually look at some of the ongoing issues that there have been in terms of the undesirability of the job. I wrote a book, over 10 years ago now, called Heads on the Block, which was about how undesirable the position was, how risky it was, how awful it is when things go wrong, how media attention, unwanted media attention, is really just, you can't be unpredictable. So there's a lot of reasons not to go into the job. So I think the kind of challenges of which go beyond the fact that a few people get a high paycheck in the English context, most of them don't. People don't do the job for the money generally. They do it because it's a worthwhile job, and I think they're committed to it, and they've got a vocational sense. And I think we have to go really to work with that vocational sense, but also think about, what we've been doing so far that institutionally prevents a lot of people already from wanting to be in it, and what causes them to go.
Can I get you to pick up this question and maybe respond to a few things that you've heard from Pat? We know that many of our participants today, from the comments they're making in our comment section, they're very fired up by your passion and your enthusiasm. So let's try and keep that going. It's what we cling to in this
Okay.
after year that we've had.
Okay, I will try to. May I compare the COVID-19 with divorce? I don't know if you have divorce in Australia, but in the rest of the world, I can assure you many people get divorced more than ever in the past.
Oh yeah,
So
no, sure, we have divorce here, of course.
Yeah, I know, I'm just cynical. Yeah, of course. But let's look at divorce. When we read the reports of the narratives of people after divorce, 5 years later after divorce, some of them look at their divorce process as a process of self-renewal. They talk about the way they reframe their life. They talk about enthusiasm. They talk sometimes about the second life, okay? Now, COVID-19 is a wonderful opportunity to many of our educational leaders. Why? Because it forced many of them to break the routine, to break current thoughts of education. Now, if we just look at one principal, for example, educational leader principal, whatever, in their early 40s, they grow up in a very stable, at least in the Western world, in a very stable environment. They believe that student achievement is the target or the ultimate purpose of education. And here came the divorce or the corona, if we want to remember that we are talking about corona, not divorce, and say that, hey, people, the world is not as stable as you thought. The world is not stable. The world, just reading about books about last endemics shows us how the world is not stable. And then what it means that maybe we have a chance to create, not create, this is not the word, but to engender new kind of school leaders, those who understand that they can't lead without being reflective. They must reflect on the current year, okay, upon the last year. They have to be to think about the students in different ways. They have to remember, for example, that the corona changed our life in many ways. But one of them, when it comes to education, was that we learned not only that Zoom can be a substitute, it can't, by the way, it can't, okay? It can be a substitute to a classroom, but it can fill the gap in many times. For example, in a stormy day, we can change and say, now the day after we are going to stay at home, and we can do something on the city level for all the parents, because now we can connect all the parents in the city in one event. So this is what we call, what I say, to think out of the blue, out of the box, okay? Which means that we cannot forget the implications of the corona. We must think the lessons of the corona in terms of creativity and so whatsoever.
I'm going to move on to our next question, which are what the implications of the pandemic are for who becomes educational leaders, who we want as leaders, and what leadership is and should be for. And Peter Anderson, I'll get you to lead off here. In particular, it's interesting to hear from you, given what Pat Thompson has said about who those leaders have been anyway leading up to the pandemic. So if there's a change coming, it'll have to be an absolutely massive one in order for it to look any different to how it was before. So maybe you can lead us off there, Peter.
Yeah, and I think I'll sort of speak from my position, and as Aboriginal people, we're very patient in this country. We're in the school leadership area. It is constantly reactive. We react. A new government comes in, there's a new policy, there's a new program to actually talk about Indigenous school achievement. So we're constantly, responsive. We're, being really responsive. And I think what COVID has done, I guess, has shown schools and school leaders that they can be responsive as well. But how do you actually be responsive, which is, in a way, going back to what we've been talking about, that centres communities, that centres learners, that values teachers, that values schools. So I think that, for me, is one of the things in terms of going forward. If anything, as a non-Indigenous person, you can actually understand what I know of being shut out of the system and these inequalities that have happened. There's some sort of emotive connection that you can have as a leader. All too often, I think in the leadership space, we wait for I need to find an Indigenous person to do that because I have no agency. What COVID has actually done, they said, no, you have to do it. If it's gendered, a male principal, you have to do this. I can do this, and this is how I do it. So I think there's that, if it's anything, it's a level of agility, and it's okay to go into the unknown. But I will, draw on my colleagues, community to actually go forward. So I think for me, it's actually planning and moving beyond the reactive to a much more sustainable future for Indigenous learners, but also for, particularly in Australia, non-Indigenous learners, because we don't have very many Indigenous teachers because they leave the profession after about 3 or 4 years from burnout. How do and so there's a level of collegiality within a school. How are schools actually tackling or embedding Indigenous content and curriculum, engaging in these various different things as a community, as a learning community? How are we doing this? So I think there's an openness there, which I'm excited to look at, to tap into, to how we go forward. within the Indigenous education system, for example, just as a systems level, nationally, the higher education system does not talk to the primary and secondary system at the federal level. So we can't even get a conversation around a pipeline in terms of funding, et cetera, and policy. So these are some things that may be highlighted, I think. But I'm, as I said, as an Aboriginal person, I'm patient, and I'll see what happens, and I'll watch this space.
Yeah. Your patience is ages and eons long. We know that. Laurie, can I turn to you about what the implications of the pandemic might be for who becomes educational leaders?
Look, I certainly resonate with what Peter said. Privilege is his context as an Aboriginal person. And I think about us within the Caribbean, we have a different way of making sense of things. Many of us were brought to the Caribbean on ships, on slave ships, and we crossed the transatlantic route. And if you know anything about that history, you would know that in fitting us in small spaces, what we have learned to do over time historically is a dance we call in the Caribbean called the limbo. And the limbo is really about making space where there is none. So while Peter speaks to his patience, I think it's important for us within the Caribbean, we speak to our subversive nature, our subversivity. Because we don't wait to be given, because we know that it's likely that if we wait, we are not likely to receive in the time that we need. So we create the spaces, we make the spaces, and therefore I think when we think about the issues that we are confronting with in terms of who do we want to become as leaders, I think patience is important because you need to watch this space. But I also think the ability to make space where there is none, particularly for the communities that you serve. So I think those new leaders coming in, and in fact, for us within the Caribbean, it's something that we have been doing, the importance of processing and predicting so that you can find those spaces, those opportunities, and occupy those spaces and opportunities for as long as you can occupy those spaces and opportunities. And then also recognizing that as time changes and as history changes, you have to again engage in a different kind of limbo, a different kind of dance. And that continuous notion of making space where there is none, how do we communicate that to our leaders? How do we prepare our leaders for that kind of reality where they have to stay in a state of continuous flux, where they have to they become comfortable with change, and that's, I think, is very difficult. We have been engaging with it and confronting it for over 500 years in the Caribbean because of the concept of historical conditionalities that came into shaping the contestation that is within the Caribbean. So I would argue that we have to become all limbo dancers if we think about it globally, and we create space where there is none.
Is that what Isam meant, Laurette, when he started our conversation this evening by talking about flexibility? Because I know that's pretty big in limbo as well.
It is a form. It is a form. But remembering that the space that we are operating, flexibility also assumes that there is a great deal of opportunity to flex, to change and move. But within a very small space, for those of us who have been operating on the margins, for those of us who have very little voices, for those of us from the Caribbean, because of our sheer numbers, we can't compete with the millions of people in places like Australia or England or the US. Our numbers are much smaller. I mean, 16 point something million people in the Caribbean community. It's probably one state in the United States. Yeah. So we have smaller spaces, and therefore, when we think about that limbo, the way the educational leaders need to operate, you have to create this space. So you can't wait for somebody to do it for you. And I appreciate everything my colleagues were saying. There are responsibilities for our systems, but there are also responsibilities for our schools and our communities and our leaders. And our leaders must take up those opportunities to make space where there is none.
Jane, can I get you to pick up there, and then we'll move to some of the terrific questions being proffered today by our participants. Jane?
I really like the idea of subversion that Laurette raises. I'm just going to make 2 points that when I talked earlier about educational leadership needing to change from this sort of notion, all the claims that are made for it, I'd like to just say that I think we need to temper our claims for leadership. we need to be modest in what it can achieve and what it can't achieve. We need to be really clear-eyed. And I'm going to give you an example. 800,000 Australian families and children were lifted out of poverty last year by the Australian government because of changes to welfare support, both job seeker and job keeper, that meant that nearly 1 million children and families were able to go out, for example, and buy fresh fruit. Mothers and parents could buy fresh fruit for their kids because they'd not been able to afford that before. You know, these are the sorts of little things, but the kinds of indignities that children in poverty and families in poverty have to live with every day. Thanks to our federal government, those welfare supports have now been removed, and we now have 800,000 children and families moving back into poverty. So when we look at things like mental health issues and how that plays out in schools, we look at drug addiction and how that, and the impact of poverty and how that plays out in our schools. We have to remember, going back to Pat's point, that there is only so much schools can do and education systems. We can do so much, but we can only do so much. And so we need to temper to think about modestly what we can achieve, what is possible, but also how we need to build those coalitions between various groups beyond education to make the kinds of change, really transformative changes that we know are possible and that can be done.
I might get you to step in here just before we go to some questions from our participants today about what leadership is and should be for, given the implications of the pandemic and what we've all come through.
Okay, very shortly. Next week, I'm going back to the university to teach after 1 year face-to-face. And I told to my students that I'm very excited because so far I've not seen them. All I could see is their face. And you know, the human being is more than face. The human being is a complex system that transmits its uniqueness, its identity through many, many channels. So next week, I'm going to see the other channels. And what I'm trying to say by that is the next leader, the educational leader should be a person-oriented first and foremost. A person-oriented means that now after the corona, they should understand the miserable aspects within their pupils. Okay, if I could say that they should understand what they felt during the corona. Because, for example, when we told them via the Zoom, and I told them that most of my students are teachers. I said, hey, look, you see the difficulties you are facing day after day in my classroom. Okay, it's not a classroom. So this is what your pupils, your students are facing day after day. So please be more patient. Okay, if I take Peter's word here from other arena to this arena, be more patient towards your students or with your students, whatever you call.
Did you want to jump in there, Pat?
When I'm asked this question often by students in England, I actually often talk about the kind of Australian example. There's a lot of talk about Australia. I actually talk about Aboriginal peoples in Australia, and you know, the fact that they are the older. Most Brits don't know the fact that Aboriginal peoples are the oldest living civilization on Earth, and in order to do that, they've had an extremely effective curriculum and a really sensible system of educational leadership, which has been distributed. And education has been part of understanding who we are, how we have to live here, how we can be in tune with our environment. And I think it's some of those kind of core questions actually that we want from educational leaders. We want them to have in thinking about what's the purpose of education. It's how do we live well with each other? How do we live with everything else on the planet at this time? How can we support each other to actually, you know, move forward in some way that's going to be good for everybody? I think that's a very kind of humanist sort of approach in a way, but I think they're the kind of questions, they're the conversations that I think people look to educational leaders to have. They expect us, I think, to be able to tell and to be storytellers stories which are meaningful about not only schooling, but also kind of the world and where it might be, where it's been, where it's going. So that would be my kind of answer, I think, as a more sort of narrative, looking at, education as a generational kind of enterprise.
We've got some really interesting questions coming in, and around about 20 odd minutes of conversation left between us, but that's pitching it generously, maybe a little bit less. And I did want to ask you some final thoughts before we wrap up our conversation today about where we go from here, an opportunity for you to quickly go to some key observations there. But Fiona asks if the panel feel that these disruptive experiences open real potential for positive transformations of schooling. Does anyone feel particularly moved to start off by answering that? Or shall I dob someone in? I might dob you in, Peter. Sorry, Pat, I've called him. I'll go to you next, Pat. Go, Peter.
So could you just repeat that once again?
Sure. Fiona says, I'd like to know if the panel feels that these disruptive experiences open the real potential for the positive transformation of what we call schooling.
Yeah. I think the disruption, so if I can make a distinction and everything that we've been talking about and to actually centre myself, in and of myself, I'm disruptive of the system as an Aboriginal man who is a professor. So I'm hoping that the disruption, because when I call this out, I'm being subversive, I'm the problem, I'm making people uncomfortable. So you shut down. So I'm thinking, people have this experience now. How do you now then take that experience and engage? Because I'm done with the emotional labour. As I keep saying, how do we distribute this? And that's something that as Aboriginal educators in this country, as I keep coming back to it, into this colonial system where we were, education was used to colonise, assimilate, etc. And it's quite ontologically violent towards us. How do we actually share that around, I think? And so I'm hoping that this sort of disruption in the profession or in leadership or whatever it is, actually sort of emotionally jars people to actually think outside the box and to actually have that agency that I can actually do something different. I can actually, treat my professional school as a collective. As I said, I'm patient and I watch with bated breath.
Pat, you wanted to say something there?
I was going to say something more prosaic, really. I was going to say, I think one of the positive things that's happened here in the UK has been the kind of recovery of the arts. And I would say this, I think, but, the arts have had pretty short shrift in the curriculum, particularly in England recently. And of course, one of the things that people have rediscovered actually is the importance of play, children's right to play, which of course has been variously distributed among children living in different kinds of circumstances, but the importance of play, the importance of working through a variety of kind of art forms and genres and platforms. And I think schools have found, as they've been working online, they've made new partnerships with arts organisations. Arts organisations have changed what they do. And there's a potential for that to perhaps change the balance of the curriculum so that, other ways of knowing and other ways of communicating besides writing the multiple choice answer and the essay question, perhaps other ways of doing things are going to have a chance to come back in. So that's a kind of a much smaller sort of point, I think, about where we might be. I think in England, we're poised to either re-embrace other forms of knowing and ways of learning or not.
Yeah. Let me go to another question, and this one's being voted up substantially by our participants today. And it's interesting how this is the highest ranking question right now, because it's an eminently pragmatic and practical one, even while it's potentially deeply inspiring. Amanda asks, I'd love to hear the panel's thoughts on what advice they'd give a beginning principal. And Iza, I'm going to start with you.
Okay, beginning principalship is a very difficult time in the principal's life. Okay, I mean, The first 2 years are very difficult. This is a time that we call it the time of managerial identity building. So I wouldn't recommend any new principal to start by innovating new things, because you can't innovate before you understand the infrastructure, before you understand the ground. So I know that my recommendation contradicts policy makers' expectations or supervisors' expectations from new principles, but we can't do things before we build our managerial identity, particularly in times of crisis. Because in Israel, for example, every new principal gets a mentor. A mentor who is usually a mid-career principal, very experienced one, who accompanies the beginning principal. So the question was very broad. That's why I can't be more specific, but it's a very broad. But I would recommend to read some papers about beginning principalship in order to understand the complex situation in which every new principal is.
Any quick thoughts on this from anyone else?
Yeah, I think I listened to the Isra, and I smile as I reflect upon my own experiences of getting into leadership. And I think it's something that was said to me that at the time was stark. And I was told to work on developing a capacity for frustration. It speaks to Peter's notion of patience. I think in the early stages, before you jump in and try to change anything, you really must work on recognizing that the chair, it can be frustrating, the seat is frustrating, but in order to navigate that frustration, you also have to build your patience. You have to wait, you have to watch, you have to attend, and you wait for spaces to open up. In some cases, you wait for a space to open up. In some cases, you create a space through the ways in which you build your network. So apart from building your capacity for frustration, understanding that it's a journey and it's not a fast race, I think it's important that you also build your networks, your peers, because it's the resources provided by your peers in the early stages of leadership that's going to give you an increased capacity for frustration.
Okay, anyone else?
Two things probably. I agree that one of, an additional thing is finding a support network. I think for me, it's when you start a kind of leadership job, I think it's about finding out about the school and the community and who they are, and also so that's the history of the school, the neighbourhood, who's there, kind of local narratives, what it all kind of means, and at the same time, I think finding a way to deal with the little traps that get set for you, the little traps where someone comes up and says, X is a problem, and I learned very quickly, I think, to say things like, well, what would you have done about this last year? So, you just kind of keep things ticking on while you're in the process of finding out. And I think if they're big problems, you can actually set up things like a group of staff, or a group of parents and staff, a group of students, parents and staff, to actually investigate a problem if something appears to you as a problem. So I remember the last school where I was head, there were a lot of concerns about sexual harassment. We're going back a long time now. The staff were deeply divided, and my response was, well, why don't we find out? And so we set up a kind of process of trying to investigate whether there was indeed a kind of significant issue with sexual harassment. We had a conference with all the girls in the school to hear from them, and and that actually changed things. It was a very split staff, but I don't want people to think that I'm saying you have to do that, but I'm saying as an example, I think trying to think about ways in which you can find out which actually do some of the work of establishing the ways and principles of how you want to work with staff, with students, with parents, with the community, while maintaining things, seems to me to actually be the way to start off. If you come in and want to change things, what's the basis you're doing that on? What information do you actually have? not a lot.
I've got a question here that I'd love, maybe we can just get one answer, I think, to this, so you'll have to decide amongst yourselves who gets to answer this one. But having learners at home really brought home the value of schools, unis, etc., for academic learning and wellbeing and social building, which of course are issues that we've been discussing at length here this evening. What are the big lessons that governments need to take away from this pandemic for educators and educating, leading and learning? Who'd like to jump in there? I was tempted to dob you in, Jane, so go ahead.
I'd say get rid of the onerous accountability requirements that are placed on schools, fund schools fairly and equitably, provide clear and targeted supports to groups of kids who most need it. Governments are going to love this one. Hold governments, not individual teachers in schools, to account the social wellbeing and academic outcomes of children, particularly those from most disadvantaged groups. And finally, put a children's social wellbeing and equity lens across all items in government budgets at federal and state level, not just in education, obviously in education, but overall.
Yes, I don't think anyone's going to disagree with any of that. I'd like to ask you a final question, and we'll just do a sort of a round, if you like, of everyone, and you can take a moment or two to reflect on this. Where do we go from here? I guess it picks up from that final question about the lessons here and the challenges for governments. But where do you feel we should go from here? What are the issues that we most need to focus on, Laurette?
I think the only way we can go is up, keep our eyes focused on where those opportunities and spaces are available. Recognizing all the very practical things that our colleagues have said, we have to be patient, we have to manage our expectations, understanding the sets of challenges that we are confronting ourselves with in terms of education. And I think it's important for us to have a very optimistic perspective and understand the role as individuals, as leaders working in communities and working with communities that we play in having that optimism realized, but also knowing that, again, it's a journey. It's not going to happen overnight. All these great opportunities that we are seeing that is potentially available for us to address the social ills that we see within our society, we can't tackle everything one time. So we work on what we can work on and build the kinds of agencies and capacities within the people that we work with and create those opportunities for them, so that even after we move on, the legacy and the practices continue, that those kinds of uplifting kinds of practices and dispositions continue on. So I think let's focus on just moving up.
Peter Anderson?
Yeah, I really agree with what everyone has said. And I also think that it's okay to make incremental change in this space, slowly and surely. But I also think that politically, the education system and those of us who work within it, there is a value on our profession, that we are valued for the input that we have into a system that is constantly telling us, we have to react. Whether it be remuneration, school funding, etc. I think there's not an essential value on what we do. So that's probably my short statement there.
Pat Thompson?
I think everyone needs a holiday, quite frankly. I think we should, recognise that, this has been a really hard time and people actually need time to sort of heal and recover, and pressure to immediately fix things and immediately make huge amounts of difference just seem to me to be really unreasonable, and I think they should be resisted. So I think, some forms of passive resistance about unreasonable expectations and supporting the collective professional associations that leaders have to actually take on some of those unreasonable demands seem to me to be really important. I think, I read some figures recently with somebody saying it's going to take most families 17 months in the UK to just economically recover from what's happened during the pandemic. And if you think about, what's actually going to happen you know, to all those families, and there are huge numbers of them where there's been bereavements and, you know, people haven't seen each other for ages and they've been confined, you know, that's probably more than 17 months. And I think we need to be patient with ourselves, and as leaders, we need to make sure there's time and space for everyone else as well.
Pat, there's an opportunity for me just before we go to the final comments from Jane and from Iza, possibly just to slip in there, because I'd love to, Bernie's question here, which is, Bernie would love to hear from the panellists on what they believe are the implications for principal preparation, given this new reality. And I guess in part, you've maybe answered that, Pat, by suggesting that they need to go a little easy on themselves.
Yeah, and I think we've all found that during our own teaching in our own institutions as well. We've had to actually just be much more responsive, much more, you know, humane in our kind of responses, understand the very diverse circumstances that our students find themselves in. And I think that kind of unhomogenizing the view that we have of people and recognizing difference and different circumstances is part of that, it seems to me.
Is our final observations where we go from here?
I can only hope that the corona and its future, not future, I would say, I can hope that the endemic will accelerate anti-neoliberal trends that we have already seen in some places. I mean, we want education back in our classroom. We don't want accountability anymore, because the corona showed all of us that accountability simply doesn't work when a crisis is taking place in our education system. And in response to the last question, what we need now in principal preparation program is a course about crisis management, because when we read the literature about the Earth and the Earth crisis, we understand that we are going to face more and more epidemics in the future and more crises. So what we need now is our educational leaders who can face instability, who can face crisis, who can face the difference. And the difference begins with anti-neoliberal notions of accountability, standardization, and all these foolish things, to say the least.
Jane?
And I'm polite. Yeah.
Thank you. Jane, where do we go from here?
I'd say, following on from Iza, I'll ask a question of all the Australian educators and parents. Did our world fall apart because we didn't have compulsory literacy and numeracy tests conducted on nearly every grade across the Australian education system? Did our world fall apart in 2020? What were the learnings? What were the lessons? What were the things that we took away about what really matters? It was about humanity. It was about care. It was about doing hope. It was about pulling together, about doing the absolute best we could for one another. So I would talk about the broader picture of educating as opposed to schooling that's emerged around, I'll quote the Wiradjuri elders from the southern New South Wales area, from where I lived for many years, about a picture of educating as learning to live well in a world worth living in. And that this occurs across a whole range of environments. It occurred at home with the parents who were struggling to do their best. It occurs in the online environment. It occurs in the bricks and mortar of schools and university. It occurs when we go camping with our kids. As Indigenous people know, it occurs across the whole span of life and the things that you do with the family, with the community. So I think that humanising aspect of educating, of what it means to be an educator and an educational leader, that's what we hang on to. If that's the only thing you take out of principal preparation, it is about being human and humane, and that you're not on your own, that there's a whole bunch of other people out there, parents, community, kids, that you can lean on and work with, not over, on top of. That's what I would say.
It's a lovely way to finish a really terrific conversation, and you've really brought your best selves and such lovely thought and insight and experience not only of last year, but of so many years to this conversation. So thank you. So please join me in thanking wherever you are with a big virtual round of applause that we will hear ricocheting around the globe. Professor Pat Thompson, Professor Iza Oplatka, Professor Jane Wilkinson, Professor Peter Anderson, and Dr. Laurette Bristol. Thank you all very, very much. That brings our conversation to a close. Thank you, wherever you are, for joining in, for streaming, for taking part in the conversation online, and for all of your many terrific questions as well. Please register for our next event in Global Critical Conversations, and that's Is There a Science of Reading? That's taking place on Tuesday, the 25th of May. We'll include the link in the YouTube chat comments area, so you should be able to see that there.